Hi everyone, thanks for having me here. It's really lovely to be back in person doing stuff. So I'm going to talk a bit about two things really. First of all, just a general introduction to bespoke instrument development, which I've been involved in accessible instrument development for a long time. Just to give you a kind of an overview of what is available and what can be done in this kind of area, and then I'm going to do a little case study of a project that I made called Loopfree with a musician called Tim Palm. He's a Swedish musician. So I've got some, he's in Sweden obviously, so he couldn't be here, but I've got a video interview that I've made with him that I'll play with you so you can hear his point of view, and just learn a bit about how we can build, the kind of possibilities we have to build advanced bespoke instruments for musicians who need them in a way that isn't necessarily available through commercial tech. So it's a really important area, I think, and part of the mix of the kinds of things that we're looking at today and all the different instruments that are around the place. So, who am I? Well, these days I'm a sound artist. I build interactive sound art installations. I invent instruments, things. So I also run a group called Acoustic. We put on events at the Tate Modern. We've done that Red Hackathon. We do those kinds of things. And I came to this kind of work through that area. I build interactive music tech, and as a consequence, my skill set matches very closely with accessible instrument tech. So a lot of my work in this area has been done through Drake Music, and I was for 3 years, I ran the R&D program there, so also looking at the kind of more strategic level of the way that these kinds of instruments and this kind of development can be more widely available to people. One of the issues with it is that it is actually quite hard to find people to do the work and to get these kinds of instruments built, despite that they are really widely needed. So that's part of why I'm here, is just to share the basic ideas of this and to show that this stuff can be done and it really is possible to do. So why do we need to build bespoke instruments? To meet specific access requirements. Obviously, there are many, many pieces of tech and instruments that are not accessible. And even though we've got loads of great instruments here, sometimes there's not something commercially available that people can use at all. Maybe it's just not possible for people to engage in music. And so this kind of development is a way to build prototypes and allow people who don't have any other way, perhaps, of making music to make some music. So it's a really powerful tool in that sense. Also, once people become more advanced, perhaps in their practice, they want to push their music to the next level, perhaps the commercial and more easily available tech that is no longer enough for them. They've outgrown it, and they need something that's more sophisticated and more complex in order to make the music that they want to make. And that's really the case with Loopfree today. That's kind of why we made this project. So things can be hacked. You can take a piece of kit that isn't accessible and you can make it accessible. You can pull the knobs off it and put new knobs on. Suddenly, a piece of kit that you can't turn the knob on, you put a great big knob on it and you can turn it. So those kinds of things are part of this practice as well. Perhaps people want to make experimental sound art like I do, and there's nothing that does that, and they want to do that, and so they need something special to do that. And another important element of this, if I've got time, I don't know if I will have time, is to make maybe project-specific instruments, things that work outside of the normal context of what we think of as a musical instrument. So you can really kind of explode what an instrument is. So there's a project that I'm trying to show you. You can maybe build a guitar that's big enough to string between two trees, so that you're no longer limited by the kind of movements. Those kinds of things are really possible with this kind of tech, and something that I really believe in, because you can have new kinds of exciting musical experiences without a lot of the constraints that sit around traditional music ensemble or something like that, which is obviously a limit a lot of the time. So the kinds of things that we have, there's the maker movement. Many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the maker movement. Over the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge growth in the kind of technology that's available to non-masters in electrical engineering type people to be able to make tech and instruments. These are some of the boards. These are microcontroller boards. We've got Arduinos. The first one, 2006, I think, was made. Teensies, Raspberry Pis. BBC microbits are everywhere. I'm sure maybe you have come across them. These boards tend to be very cheap. They're 10 or 15 quid. Some of them up to the Bello, which is a much more sophisticated one, is up to 150. But they're enormously powerful. They're basically little computers on a chip, and they're this big. But what they enable you to do is to connect all sorts of sensors, all sorts of input devices into this and then output. Maybe they output MIDI, maybe there's a screen, maybe they output their own built-in audio. There's an enormous amount of flexibility in this kind of tech to be able to address the kind of access issues that we all want to be addressing. Along with that, there's been a massive rise in the kind of fabrication techniques that are available to people now. So laser cutting is huge. 3D printing, CNC machines enable you to make stuff that previously you would have needed a carpenter to make or something, you know, a level of expertise that you just don't need anymore in order to make a kind of functional box of a specific bespoke size and shape. Those kinds of things are really achievable now and supported by hack spaces, which is a movement. I mean, it's a movement in its current form that's been going for 20 years, but I'm a member of a hack space that's been going since 1898 in South London. The Society of Model and Experimental Engineers. So it's actually, this is a long-standing, there's a long-standing community of people out there also, which is really important, who have the skills to do this stuff. And you can really access, people are really open to this kind of work. I think people are often really happy to use their expertise in this kind of community to build accessible instruments and things. And part of that is a really open culture. So the basic starting point is sharing, is learning, doing things that you don't know how to do, finding solutions to problems that don't exist, and hacking things, making things work that don't currently work. And so there's a kind of whole community and a mindset around this kind of work that exists out there using these kinds of tools. There's, you know, also traditional metalworking, traditional woodworking, those kinds of things are available. And then on top of that, there's a set of software that is really commonly used. Max MSP and Pure Data are programming languages that are graphical programming languages that are designed specifically for music and making sounds, which have a kind of lower barrier to entry in terms of being able to get to grips with them if you're a musician. They're not text-based, they're kind of objects where you drag pipes of sound, you know, between different objects and things. And Ableton Live, in particular, is a DAW that has this kind of software built into it, which gives you access to all of the kind of traditional functionality of music software, but you can then start to access it through bespoke physical interfaces in a really easy and, well, not easy, necessarily easy, but in a fairly straightforward and doable way, an achievable way that is kind of achievable in a short space of time for people with kind of non-God level tech skills, you know, which is where most of us are at. So, advantages of this kind of development is low cost in a certain way of thinking about low cost in the sense that like the Arcana guys and the process that they're going through to make a production-ready instrument is incredibly expensive and time-consuming and complicated. But we don't necessarily need that. We can build a fully functioning, working instrument for a much lower level, and it can be done much more quickly, which makes it a really powerful kind of set of tools. Fast development and iteration, as you'll see with the video, and this project, really powerful stuff can be done very quickly. You can build something that works for one person, and it works really well for that one person. And so that's enormously powerful, because that's obviously not always the case with things that are available. And there are many supporting resources and a really supportive community if you're trying to do something and you don't know how to do it. There are so many forums and people out there who will be prepared to help you and to get you where you want to go. Finally, you don't need an industrial designer and an electrical engineer, and to get this kind of stuff done, you don't need a whole team of people. One person can actually make something that makes a huge difference. Because there's so much supporting infrastructure behind this kind of development, it's really possible to kind of move fast and do things very effectively with relatively small amounts of money and small numbers of people. Disadvantages, obviously, maybe you don't know all the people at your local hack space and you don't have access to this, so finding people can be difficult, but then talk to people like Drake Music, talk to Omi, if you're interested in that, talk to me. If you're looking for somebody, I'm always happy to do that. If you feel like you want to get involved or need somebody who has this kind of expertise, they are out there and they can be found. But you do have to do a bit of digging, because they don't necessarily have a fancy website that tells you that this is what they do. The projects can be idiosyncratic. Something about it only works for one person means it only works for one person. So it's a strength and a weakness. And trying to make some of the projects that I've seen over the years are incredibly powerful, but what what is hard to do is to take this one person's instrument and give it to 1,000 people out there who need it. And so that's the kind of limitation that while I was working in trade music in particular, I really was focused on trying to address that gap, because there's a lot of lost opportunity in moving from this kind of scale to that larger scale. Reliability and maintenance issues. You don't have a team of engineers who know how they work with schematics and all of the things that you normally get in a commercial product, and so if it breaks and the person who made it is no longer around, you can run into difficulties. So that's another kind of significant downside to this kind of project. So that is a super brief overview of this kind of work, what's possible and what can be done. I'm going to talk a little bit now about Loopfree, which is the project that we're working on. Loopfree first started in 2018 at a hackathon in Stockholm, MTF. Now, a hackathon, if you don't know, is a place where they gather a load of people together with various different kinds of expertise. Generally speaking, they say, go and make something. And it will be over a set amount of time, so maybe 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, maybe a week. This one was a week. It was in Stockholm with MTF Music Tech Fest, who run a lot of these kinds of events. And it was here, in this room, which is actually a nuclear bunker, which is, 80 or 100 meters under the ground. And it used to be a nuclear reactor for the Technical University in Stockholm, KTH. And so we all spent, Amy was there, we all spent a fairly intense 5 days buried in this nuclear bunker, worrying about getting radiation sickness and this kind of stuff. It was a very, very full-on experience. Yeah, more or less, you know. I mean, yes, not everybody was. I mean, some people came out very shaky. No natural daylight. Limited food and drink. Yeah, it was a bit odd. Anyway, so that's the kind of background. That's where the first development of this happened. And I met Tim Palm and Vahakn Matossian, who's the other person who's on the development team there, and we just basically spent. Amy, you were involved with some of it as well, weren't you?
Yeah, we were trying to set up some camera rigging for Tim as well, and it was just like the project over a week, like you say, it just didn't come to fruition. It didn't come to fruition.
But we managed over the course of that week to build a successful prototype of a fully functioning instrument, which was fantastic, fantastic. And then we've been working on it, and that was 4 years ago now. Obviously, a little hiatus for COVID, but. It's an ongoing project. Tim is going to, it's going to be an integral part of his rig, ongoing, and so this shows that in the space of just a few days, you can really make a lot of progress in this kind of area. So I want to talk about this. This is where I bring in Tim Palm. So I'm going to give you first of all. I'll turn the light off so you can see it a bit better. You can see it right. Tim makes EDM live. And so what I thought I did, this is a video, his 60-second studio tour, just so you can see what he does and how he does it, just so you've got an idea of the context that we were making the project in. Is that going to be bright enough, do you think?
This is my studio in under 60 seconds.
He's super talented. I mean, he's an amazing musician. And that rig, he calls it his spaceship. It's a kind of portable rig that he has set up with all of the different kits so that he can move and he can tour and he can perform with it. And so Loopfree is just a small part of that. Hold on.
Under 60 seconds.
I've done that now. Let's move on. So that's the context. The next slide is just a Zoom chat I had with him. It's really important that he was here to talk about his own project, but obviously he couldn't. He's in Sweden. So this is just a video that I made with him last week on Zoom, so you can understand the project overview and where he's coming from. If it plays. There we go.
Hi Tim. Could you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I'm Tim, artist named DJ Arthro, 24 years old from Sweden. I am an engineer and a teacher in maths and computer science, and I have been producing music for 10 years and have my own company.
Amazing. Now, so we're here today, we're going to talk a bit about Loopfree, which is a project that we worked on together. Could you tell us a bit about where it started and how the project began? So
we met in 2018, and around 1 or 2 years before that, I started to look at, because I've been doing electronic music for 10 years, and my goal has always been to perform live as much as possible. When performing live, you want to be able to loop stuff. Looping is when you play something once and then it beats over so you can add another thing. And I wanted to figure that out in my setup. But I've been looking at stores, I've been looking online, software, hardware, and couldn't find a solution that worked for me. Because all the interfaces were like, press this button at the same time as you play. And usually it's like, use one arm for this and one arm for the other button, or your foot and you play at the same time. But I am playing mostly with my nose. For obvious reasons, I can't press two things at the same time. So I have been thinking about that problem for, I think it was a bit less than 2 years when we met.
Okay, great. So we met at a hackathon, a week-long hackathon run by MTF, which is Music Tech Fest in Stockholm. Over the course of that week, we developed the first iteration of what became Loopfree. I wonder if you could just talk about that process, especially at the beginning, and kind of how that went over the course of the week.
So in the beginning, we were just brainstorming what should we create during these 5 days. And then I said, I have this problem that I've been thinking about for quite some time now. And then you started throwing questions at me. And I've been thinking about this for quite some time, so I knew exactly how I wanted this to work. So within, I think, 2 hours, we had filled in the gaps and had decided, okay, this is how Loopfree, not called Loopfree back then, should behave. And then we just started iterating on it.
That's right. I remember you coming to the session with a really very clear set of requirements of what you needed to do. So it was a case of filling in the gaps. And part of the development process, there were really 2 parts. One was developing the electronics and software, which I mostly did over the course of the week. And the other part was developing the physical interface that we did with Vahakn, led on that Vahakn Matossian, who runs Human Instruments. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that relationship between the physical interface that we built and the software, and how that all works together to make the system work.
So great question. So it's obvious that you need both. If you don't have the software, the physical interface is just a box that does nothing. But also, you can't just create the box without knowing what the software does. Because if the software says, hey, we need 5 buttons, but the box is only created for 3 buttons, you will have a problem. So we needed to work on these 2 aspects in parallel. So I think it was the second day, you started looking at, okay, how does this work? How does Ableton work? How does the looping work? And I talked you through how I would do it, how I would want to do it in a scenario on stage, so that you can understand. And at the same time, me and Vahakn started measuring, okay, how much movement do I have? How much pressure can I push on a button? Where can we mount this so that I can actually use this with my arm at the same time as anything with my nose? So we started developing these 2 aspects in parallel.
I remember one of the biggest challenges in the process being that we figured out that 5 buttons was about the maximum we could get onto the physical interface that you could use, but there were many functions in the software that we wanted to be able to get access to, and so figuring out how we could do that was one of the biggest challenges. But in the end, it was successful, I think. Anyway, I mean, perhaps you could tell us a bit about how that process went and where we ended up after the course of the week.
So we started for the physical interface like second day or third, I don't remember exactly, 4 years ago. We started with clamps that were really heavy and not smooth at all, but you should try it out. And at the same time, we had the first button that sent signal to the computer, so we could, iteratively work on both the physical aspect and the software aspects. And on the final day, I think it was 5 minutes before the showcase, which was at the end, we had this prototype mounted on my chair. We had the software up and running, but I haven't tried it before. So the first time we tried the final prototype of the week was live on stage, and it worked.
It worked. It was an amazing moment, wasn't it? And then what was it? So after that, obviously we're still working on the project now. It's 4 years later. So could you just talk a little bit about what happened after that and how the project's gone forward since then?
So it worked when I played, but I also knew these are some things that we need to change, because you don't know everything until you actually try it. Even if you play it in your head over 2 years, there will be things that are different when you actually do it. And we actually got funding to continue to develop this, but we only used the funding actually to travel, because you live in UK, I live in Sweden, so we still went with very cheap and basic tools to develop with, but I flew over to you, and we continued measuring, adapting, changing the code, and trying back and forth. And actually this summer, we got this huge idea that we can actually redo the entire setup in a very, very much more efficient way. So that's what we're working on right now.
That's right. So, I think it's going to carry on development, forever probably, isn't it? But I mean, if you were gonna, if somebody hasn't done this kind of process before, maybe it seems kind of intimidating. What would you say to somebody who that there's a hole in the market, that there's something that they need that doesn't exist? What advice would you give somebody in that situation in terms of maybe thinking about doing this kind of process?
The first thing is, just because you couldn't find that thing to do it now, don't give up doing it. If I would have said, I won't be able to do it now, I just not do it. Don't do that. That's a very boring way to live life. But also, 4 years later, we still question the solution. Can we do this even better? And I think you can't be afraid to question, okay, are there better ways to solve this? Can we interact with it differently? How can we optimize? And don't be afraid to think and rethink again. But always do. Because if you don't start with the first iteration, you won't get the second iteration.
Amazing. That's really helpful and great. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks.
So there we go. That's kind of talking. Oh no, hold on. Come back. New slide. Don't want to listen to it again. There we go. So that's the kind of initial process of development really that we talked about. And so this is what it looked like at the end of 4 days. It was kind of held together with gaffer tape and the full thing. But the thing worked, and we knew that it worked. And really, it's the first time I'd really done something like this, and to move from nothing to a really fully functioning instrument in such a short amount of time really shows how much can be achieved with this kind of thing. So then there's the code that we wrote. So this is Max MSP, by the way, this programming language. So you can see it's objects and pipes so that you can move data around the place within Ableton. And so this is, so up there, we realised this is the only photo we have of the first performance. because we were so panicked and running around trying to get it working that was the media we ended up with. But there's Tim on stage with Loopfree making it work, and that's all. But then we were really lucky. We won a KTH Innovation Award at the festival itself, and then we won an International Sound Award for it afterwards, which gave us just enough money, not loads of money, but a little bit of money to be able to kind of move forward and travel and move through the project and develop it even further. To the point where by the end, where we got to at the kind of beginning of lockdown, was it looked like this. It was a kind of complete object. It really worked. It really worked within Tim's setup. Just so you know, in case you're interested, we use microbits because they've got radio on them, which means we can make it wireless really cheaply and really easily. Great for prototyping for this kind of thing. I mean, really, because they're like 15 quid or something, and you can get really strong, really low latency radio communication. So enormously powerful and very, very easy to use. So that's why we focused on that. And then now, slight confession, when I first agreed to do this, the plan was that I would have version 2 of Loopfree here today to show you and say, this is how it works. But unfortunately, we discovered we're going to have to rebuild the whole thing because Tim's practice has moved on and we found new ways to do things. But this is the kind of level of finish that we will be able to get, and you can get in this kind of project. It's robust, it's strong, it really works within the context of his setup, and you can really kind of get there with what is a small amount of time and, relatively speaking, a very small amount of resources. So if there are musicians out there who need something that doesn't exist, and there's never likely to be a commercial solution, that doesn't mean that it can't be done. And this kind of process is really an achievable way of going about that kind of, dealing with that kind of situation. So that's Loopfree. Given the education context, there's another video I'd like to show. Have we got 5 minutes to show another video? Would that be okay? Or we're over time, but I started. Is that okay? So in this concept, the other video. This is John Kelly, who I think probably everybody knows, playing the Kelly Castle. I don't know, has everybody seen the Kelly Castle? I think most people have. Yeah. But I'm going to show a project that is perhaps in the educational context, something called Planted Symphony, which I worked on at Drake Music. This is the first iteration. There's been other iterations since. But this video really, what's interesting about it from this point of view is that it really explodes the idea of what an instrument is and what an accessible musical interaction can be. There's a series of 5 or 6 instruments and interfaces here that were developed as part of this project. And I just hope that, I won't talk much more about it, I'll just show the video. But it just kind of opens the door, I think, to thinking about how we can make accessible musical experiences that don't just sit within the confines of a traditional instrument. does anyone have any questions about anything?
I just want to add one
Yes.
comment that the entire makerspace community is very motivated and open to help, and that's the way that we started as well. We had no knowledge in electronics, and we just asked the questions in the community, and they're so happy to help. And,
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It really is a kind of open and welcoming community that really like working on these kinds of projects in particular. So you can take advantage of that. And look where you can go. You can end up with what is an amazing instrument. So.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Steve. It's great there are people like you doing fantastic things like this. So absolutely fantastic. Tommy's a rumbling. It's time for lunch. You may have seen some evaluation forms on your chairs.